Welcome to the Beer and Picknell Show. We have James Reyes-Picknell, best-selling author, speaker, consultant, trainer, and trusted advisor, expert in productivity wherever physical assets are used. We have Richard Beer. He's CEO and trainer, innovator to industries such as manufacturing, food processing, transportation, healthcare, and more. And then I'm Hutan Ghaffari Saravi, head of media at TRO Solutions and moderator, editor of this show. How are you guys?
Good, and you?
Awesome. We actually did an intro this time, and I'm proud. We're actually
we're getting better at it.
Yeah.
Well, I know from previous comments people have made online that they like these, so
good. Well, we discussed this week we would talk about how to move from reactive to proactive. So that's just going to be our episode today.
Sure.
Our discussion contents are going to be efficiency, effectiveness. We're going to talk about leadership because you need good leadership to achieve those things. And then a really spicy topic, buy-in and ownership, because we all know how hard that is. And then if we have time at the end, there's levels of learning, which are important to acknowledge.
Yeah. So it takes a long time to actually evolve from a reactive to a proactive approach to asset management. I don't know what you find, Jim. I find it's not a genie out of the bottle cookie cutter solution. It's an evolution for each organization to holistically approach and move from that reactive to proactive maintenance and asset management.
Yeah, I agree totally. It is not a quick change. Some organizations kind of start out in a proactive way, but they're relatively few, right? Like airlines are a good example, right? They everything's thought out well in advance before the plane ever leaves the ground for the first time. So they know how to keep it operating reliably. They know what maintenance is needed in order to achieve that. They know how to operate it within its limits. So they do a good job there. I find military, I've got a bit of military background and military projects. They do something very similar. A lot of planning up front to get them into that mode where when they start up, they know exactly what they have to do, how to do it, when to do it. They do it really well. They're trained for it. And when something goes wrong, they're prepared for it. They've actually got all the parts, the tools, and so on. But getting there in both those cases takes an awful lot of prep work. So, they literally years before those systems are fielded, they are determining what can fail, what can go wrong, what maintenance is required, what repairs are going to be required, what spare parts are they going to need, in what quantities, how often are they going to arise, is demand going to arise? That sort of thinking is done up front in both of those industries, and it's rarely done anywhere else. So many companies,
and even when it's done, there's the continuous cycle of continuous improvement, right? There are always tweaks, changes that you need to make, improvements in, whether it's your work management process or your reliability-centered maintenance approach and analysis. There's always tweaks to be made.
Yeah, there are. I do a ton of RCM work, and no matter how well you do it, no matter how well you think you forecast what can go wrong and how often, there's always something you miss, or you get something a little bit wrong, right? You think it's going to fail with age, so you plan a preventive maintenance routine, and you find out in practice it actually fails more randomly because the environment creates more triggers for failure, and it ends up being more of a random thing. So there's little things like that you tweak, and like you say, in your business processes around planning, scheduling, the links with supply chain. Right now, these days, COVID's ending, the world's slowly getting back to normal, but everybody's struggling with supply chain. And it's not that their processes are necessarily a problem, but the lead times are horrendous right now because of the impact of COVID on a lot of the countries where a lot of materials come from.
Right.
So the front end of the supply chain has been slowed down. And of course, all the transport has been slowed down. So lead times are just tremendously long right now for a lot of things. And in some cases, commodities, computer chips not too long ago were a problem. They were slowing down the automotive industry. Stuff's just not available. So in maintenance, in our little corner of the world, that means you don't have parts. And if you didn't have them already, good luck getting them in a hurry. Because
well, that's a very good point, because a client recently called in a panic because they had a just-in-time philosophy for a lot of their parts, MRO parts, and they tried FedEx overnight, and because of the snowstorm last weekend, FedEx canceled the shipment, and they were still without parts. So we took a look at, lessons learned. Do you really want to simply rely on a just-in-time mentality, or if it's a critical spare, keep it on the shelf? Yes, there's a cost to storing that part. There's also a cost, as they found out, not being up and running because that part simply can't be shipped.
Lean and just in time depend very, very heavily on supply chains working very smoothly and without glitches. And this is probably the first time in history that we have had a global interruption to supply chains as a result of something that affected everybody. Right? Yeah. And in this case, it was a pandemic. The last one was in 1918 or something like that. So this is the first time we've experienced that. Other big calamities that could interrupt it are wars. And of course, in the last biggie, the Second World War, I guess would probably be that one for the Western world. The supply chains were not quite so dependent on just in time, and a lot of the materials and so forth were sourced much more locally. And, so America became kind of the manufacturing center to provide materiel for the European and Pacific War efforts, but they had the raw materials, they had the manufacturing capacity. They weren't dependent on chips coming from China. They weren't dependent. They weren't dependent on a supply chain that's staffed with inexpensive people in some far off country. I think the one exception, rubber, was an issue. I remember. A bit of a history lesson, but a lot of the rubber in those days was actually natural rubber, and it did come from tropical countries in the far Pacific. So the supply of rubber became a real problem for the war effort, and you saw a lot of development in creating synthetic rubbers, and so a lot of what we see on the road today, literally, is a result of research and development that got done to supply rubber when the natural supply disappeared. That was Second World War. But the supply chains we have today are dependent on supply chains working, but also communications working incredibly well. And communications didn't exist in those days. So even an efficient supply chain long ago still was kind of slow compared with what it is today in a lean, just-in-time environment.
But what you're saying is the airlines and military are the exemplary organizations.
When it comes to being proactive and setting yourself up for success, they do it well. In the military, they have a thing called integrated logistics support, which is much the same as what they do in aircraft, but they do all the thinking up front. So you do not, put it this way, would you fly on an airplane where the maintenance program was being designed using root cause methods? And if you understand root cause failure analysis,
I don't know what that means.
The answer to that one is a big no, not a chance, right? Because you're going to wait until things break and then figure out what to do about them. And in the aircraft industry, they use a method that was actually developed in that industry, reliability-centered maintenance. And the idea is to forecast what can go wrong and then basically determine what to do to minimize or eliminate the consequences of those failures, recognizing that the failures are likely to happen anyways. But what do you do to minimize the consequence, right? Like, you don't care if something fails on an airplane as long as it doesn't cause it to crash. And if you can do some kind of maintenance activity that might prevent it or give you advance warning so that you can take action to make the plane safe, then that's what you do. And that's what that method is all about. Nuclear power.
That's where the effectiveness comes in, right? You doing the right maintenance at the right time. Right?
Well, yeah, and the effectiveness is the right maintenance part. The right time is an efficiency thing, right?
Exactly.
So we spelled out what to do and when, but you actually have to do it, and that's where the efficiency comes in. Or yeah, efficiency and planning, scheduling. This is where your computerized maintenance systems. This is where the supply chain has to have the parts in time for you, you know, and of course, to do that, they have to have forecasts. Planning has to tell them what's needed, when it's needed, how often it's going to be needed. You know, that's all efficiency. That's process and people.
Exactly. And so what often happens is both have to take place together and work together. Efficiency, effectiveness have to work together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And a lot of organizations, they focus solely on the work management piece, which is a small element of your efficiency.
Exactly.
It's
I've
not
seen
the
that.
entire picture.
Yeah, they think maintenance is all about getting work done, so work management makes sense.
Exactly.
And they're thinking, let's cut cost in maintenance, you know, and that is just a small piece of the benefit you can get here if you get this whole equation right. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, like, it just feels like, how can something be efficient but not effective? It feels like a riddle.
You know, there's an interesting YouTube video that I like to show people when I do some of my uptime training, and it's a clip of a fellow who's coming out of a building in the middle of winter in a snowstorm, and there's a row of cars parked on the side of the street covered in snow. And he's got a briefcase under his arm, and he uses the briefcase to clear some of the snow off the windows of the car. I think he pulls a credit card out at some point, scrapes some ice, gets the car kind of clear so you can actually get into it without filling it with snow off your roof. Pulls his keys out of his pockets, pushes the button, the beep and the lights blink for the car ahead of the one that he just cleaned off. So he was very good at doing the work the right way, right? Given the tools that he had, he did a good job, but he did it on the wrong car. So he was efficient, but he was ineffective.
Yeah.
Okay. Now the next guy coming out for the other car would have been totally happy. All right. But that's how I kind of explain to people. Here's what efficiency is. Like, just watch this guy. He does a great job, right? Getting ready to get into his car in these really adverse conditions. Then he pushes the button and everybody laughs, right? And he did things the right way, but he did them on the wrong car.
As you said, right maintenance. The right maintenance is effectiveness. At the right time is the efficiency. So he did it at the right time, but didn't do the right maintenance. Wasn't the right car.
He actually did the right maintenance, but he did it on the wrong car.
The wrong car.
Oh,
exactly. It has to be a whole holistic approach, right?
Exactly.
The right asset, the right maintenance, the right time. Everything has to come together.
Yeah.
I can do the right
things. Another example I see often in plant environments is where they do shutdowns. They shut the plant down, they tear everything apart, they inspect it, they do some repairs, they put it all back together again, they go to start up and they have problems. Problems stem from, okay, first of all, they don't shut it down very often. So starting it up, you're going to make mistakes. Operators make mistakes. The maintainers, during the work that they're doing, they may find work they need to do that they don't have parts for, so they can't put it back together quite right. So they've kind of created a scenario there where they're forced to put some things back together that aren't right. They've disturbed an awful lot of stuff that was running just fine. All right. Chances of making a mistake, getting it all back together are pretty high. And people don't like to admit it, but no matter how careful you are, it's real easy to make a mistake. So they've actually done an efficient job, and they may have had always for a shutdown, you've always got a time frame, right? It's got to be done in 5 days or whatever. And there's a ton of work. They got a lot of contractors around. Typically, there's just it's a beehive, a buzz of activity, a lot of money being spent, no production at all at that time. And things go wrong. So schedule starts to slip, and then there's a rush. Let's get it back on schedule. So now that people are rushed, they start making even more mistakes.
Yeah, exactly.
You find out at startup, all right, because things don't work. Mistakes are made. Even if mistakes aren't made, some stuff just doesn't work properly anymore. It all stems from the fact that you disturbed things that were operating perfectly well before the shutdown, and you somehow miraculously it's going to work well when you start it back up again. Well, it just doesn't work that way.
It's not just shutdowns that happens, right? Organizations, they'll do cleaning of their assets and take it apart to do that nightly cleaning. And then they expect it to miraculously be all operational the next morning after putting it back together.
Yeah.
And that rarely happens.
Yeah.
And then they end up with issues, bigger issues than the cleaning was originally intended to address.
Yeah. There are a lot of maintenance activities that are disruptive to the asset. They are intrusive to the equipment. And anytime you take something apart, there's a chance you're going to mess something else up. I'm a real proponent of using predictive technologies, vibrations, thermal imaging, ultrasound, and so on, to determine whether you need to work on something or not. To take it apart to see if why it's still working well is just plain nuts, in my opinion. You could have used some of these predictive technologies to tell you that you have problems or don't have problems. I have a motorcycle, and if I followed the maintenance schedule, they'd be tearing it apart and checking valve clearances and all kinds of little things on a fairly regular basis. And I don't do any of that. Yet it runs really smoothly. How do I get away with it? Well, I just observe how it's running, right? It runs smoothly. It runs well. It's not consuming any extra fuel. It's just as efficient as it was when it was new, probably maybe even more so. And because I'm seeing no signs of performance problems, I know that the physical stuff inside it is running just fine. I don't hear any sounds that are abnormal. I don't feel anything different when I crack the throttle open. It takes off like I want it to, and so the performance of the asset and the few little things that I'm monitoring, which are, and they're not high tech monitoring. This is high touch, not high tech. In my case, it all tells me that there's nothing wrong, nothing to worry about. So why rip it all apart and run the risk of something being done incorrectly? And people don't do that in their plants. Yeah, that now in a plant you got a lot more than just a motorcycle, but there's all kinds of technology you can be using to test condition of things. But that's part of being proactive. Find out what's wrong before you do the work, not waiting until it is wrong. I've seen a lot of work orders that say, inspect and repair as required. And to do the inspection, people will assume they got to tear everything apart. And they will proceed to do that. They'll check clearances and whatever. Now, you're taking apart, say, an engine, right? You got pistons and cylinders and rings, and you're going to see little minor scratches in the cylinders. You're going to see a tiny bit of wear. You're going to see maybe some metal polishing, on the surfaces. If it's a cylinder, if it's a piston that runs on an angle, there'll be a little bit of polishing on the bottom. There's a little bit of extra rubbing just because you got that tiny bit of extra weight in that direction. And people will look at that and say, oh, it's worn, I have to replace it. And I shake my head and think, why on earth would you even touch it? It was running just fine before you took it apart. What makes you think it won't run fine if you don't take it apart?
Interesting. Yeah.
When I do the planning and scheduling workshops, I use that exact phrase as an example of how your task that you have scoped is both ineffective, as Jim's just describing, and inefficient. And it's inefficient because Jim can take that line to mean X, and Hutan, you could take that line to mean something completely opposite, Y. And so then you've now done the maintenance two different ways. How are you going to possibly have an efficient work management process?
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, the very fact that you're doing the work is inefficient. Right? If you could do a predictive check, all right, it's non-intrusive. You don't have to take anything apart to do it. You need a little bit of equipment. You monitor it. You say, okay, everything's fine. I'm not going to touch this thing. That doesn't take long. But if you want to tear it apart and inspect it, you're going to be in there for hours. So you're consuming more resources than you need to, which is costing more, and you're increasing the risk of doing something wrong, and meaning that it won't start up properly when you go to run it again. And we see that all the time.
And this is called intrusive maintenance, you'd call it?
I've never called it intrusive maintenance, but that's actually a pretty good name for it, because
right.
Overhauls, turnarounds, shutdowns all involve tearing stuff apart and putting it back together. Now, some work is needed on a fixed interval basis, right? Like heat exchangers, for example, do get gunked up and need to be cleaned. So yeah, okay, you kind of have to do those. But you don't have to do everything. And what I find in shutdowns, there's a tendency to build in opportunities to screw things up. So I know I'm going to be down to do something that I need to do. So I'm going to take advantage of that time to do other work that's in my backlog. It's not yet finished, just because I'm down and it's convenient to do it. But that other work, it may well entail stripping things apart and disturbing them, and yet they were working just fine. So you're actually adding work scope. You're adding risk of creating problems. At startup, when something breaks down, they call it infant mortality. The largest portion of failures that you're ever going to encounter, and any reliability person will tell you this, it's infant mortality. It's because you messed with something.
Oh,
right? And I mean, I'm sure everybody that's watching this has taken something apart and struggled to put it back together correctly. Yeah. And things don't always work as well when you put them back together as they did before. And that's infant mortality showing its face. It's because you disturb things. So if you don't touch it, you can't mess it up.
And you disturb something that almost wasn't worth disturbing. You left it in a worse condition.
Bingo.
A good analogy would be if you have like an iPad with a screen protector on it and there's this like tiny speck of dust in the center. So you rip the entire thing off just to take that off, and then putting it back down. Now you've got like 5 more dust particles, and it's not even as sticky anymore. And it's just, you just ruin the whole thing. You might as well not even use it anymore.
There you go.
Yep.
And that's actually a very good example that I'm sure a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah.
So, my book Uptime has a model in it that's kind of got this efficiency and effectiveness concept underlying it, right? Like it talks about strategy and work management and systems and reliability and maintenance and all these things. But the underlying piece at the bottom of it is all about leadership, having a plan of what you're going to do, doing it intelligently, making sure people are trained. It's all about setting the stage for success. The middle chunk is the stuff about doing things efficiently. It's all about efficiency in the middle. It's work management, materials supply, and so on. And the top level is all about doing the right things. Now, why is it on the top and not in the middle? Most people, Richard said it earlier already, you need to do the two together, really. It's a pyramid, so something's going to be at the top. The top performing organizations do have highly reliable assets, so reliability goes at the top. But in truth, you have to implement the two together. I've been asked by customers, and I built a little chart that shows the flow of value in the work that we do. Because they said, like, you're talking about work management, materials, supply chain processes, you're talking about doing reliability work. How does this all add value for us? So literally in a meeting, I got up on the whiteboard and I drew a little diagram. And that diagram ended up in a book. But basically, you've got the efficiency side and the effectiveness side. On the efficiency side, it's largely work and materials management activities, right, that are going to save you money. Be efficient in deploying the workforce. And part of that is making sure you have the materials when you need them and where you need them. On the reliability or on the effectiveness side, it's all about improving reliability. But it has two effects. On the efficiency side, really, you're just saving money. On the effectiveness side, you're saving money and increasing revenues, because if you're doing the right maintenance, the assets will actually be more reliable, more available to you, and you can actually use them more. So they have the ability now to produce more revenue for you. So, and that's my big focus when I talk with my clients is you know, if they're only interested in cost savings, they'll get some savings for sure, but they'll miss an opportunity on the revenue side if they only focus on work management, which you also talked about earlier, right? If that's all they focus on, yeah, they'll save a little bit. They'll never get the savings potential that they could get, though, if they're being very efficient doing the wrong work. So you got to be doing the right work too. So reliability needs to be part of the focus. Efficiency, the processes you're using, also need to be part of the focus.
And you have to get buy-in from everybody, not just the maintenance group, not just the people on the shop floor. It's the entire organization has to buy into a more proactive approach and understand each department's impact on the asset, right? The extreme example I give is often procurement. You know, oh, what do we have to do with the asset? Well, you're buying it, right? How do you know what you're buying? What are the requirements, right? Who do you need to involve in that decision making as to we're going to buy this asset opposed to another kind, right? You involve maintenance, engineering. You got to get everybody to buy in to the proactive approach, right? And the earlier you start, the better success you have.
Yeah, that's a huge challenge too. I've found that if you try and tell people what they're going to be doing, we've got this better maintenance process, and we've got these better supply chain processes, and we've got this reliability method we're going to use. You just tell people about it, they're not going to do it. They will resist. They need to buy into it. One way I have used quite successfully actually is to teach people what all this stuff is and how it works together. And so I actually like to start engagements with some overview training on what we're doing in a holistic perspective. And while we're doing it, I ask them to save their ideas, like literally write them on yellow stickies. And when you have an idea of something we can change, write it down. And at the end of it all, I get all those ideas together and we kind of put them on the board and cluster the similar ideas together, and we create a bit of an improvement plan. Well, that activity, it not only does it help build you a prioritized planning for what you're going to be doing, but it also gets their buy-in because it's their writing, it's their ideas.
Yeah.
Right? You've kind of planted the seeds with the training, which is useful because a lot of them don't understand the big picture, right? Like a planner knows planning, but he doesn't know reliability. A reliability engineer doesn't really know much about work management. A stores person doesn't know much about either of those two things. So you get them all in the room together. They learn a little bit about each other's discipline, and then they start to see opportunities and they write them down. And that helps to make the improvements you're going to be doing later their idea. It's their stuff. And have them vote on priorities for these things and use that to guide your process of making the improvements. But where I've seen people come in and say, well, oh, I know what has to be done. We've got to change this. And I need to train my planners and my planning process needs to be a little bit more disciplined. And they focus on them and nothing changes. First of all, they've imposed it on the planners only. Well, planners can't do a great job without good scheduling, and the scheduling depends heavily on the material supply. The material supply depends heavily on the planner's forecasting. Yeah. If all you teach them to do is plan a job, that's all they'll be able to do. They need to be able to forecast demand in the long term, and a lot of people don't teach them how to do that. So the supply chain's always starved for that information, and their only way to get it is through usage in the storeroom. And if it's not if the parts aren't there at any point, the maintainers go out and buy them on their own, and invariably buy a few extra, which end up in the bottom drawer of their desk. And that just totally throws off the supply chain's opportunity to even capture the data. So it very quickly gets out of hand.
If you want to know more about that, that's in our last episode. We literally talk about secret warehouses and how it affects the supply chains. But
so the example Jim though gave earlier of the ideas coming from the people themselves, right? Not only does it gain buy-in, it also gets them to own it. One of the analogies I often use in training is how many of the attendees drive a car. And, inevitably, it's almost everybody who raises their hands. And then I say, okay, how many of you have rented a car? And they'll all put up their hands. And then I say, okay, how many of you have washed your rental car? And nobody raises their hand. And then I say, how many of you wash the car you own? And they all raise their hand. Why? Because you own it. You've taken ownership of it. And unless you own the ideas, unless you buy into the ideas, it's very hard to move people from a reactive stage to a proactive. Oh, we've been doing this the same way for 30 years. Why do we have to change now? Right?
Definitely.
Yeah. Everybody buys into the fact that they want a clean rental car when they pick it up, but they will not own the fact that maybe they ought to do the cleaning.
Exactly.
That's not going to happen. And when you go to work in your plant or your mobile fleet or whatever asset you're working in, do you own it? No. But do you take ownership of its performance? And that depends an awful lot on factors that have absolutely nothing to do with the physical asset itself. It has a lot to do with, okay, how do they motivate you? Have you had any say in how it's maintained, right? And I don't know, time after time I run into maintainers that say, they ask us to do this stuff and it makes no sense at all. So you think they own it? If you ask them, should we change it? They'll say yes. And will they take ownership of the changes? Absolutely. But all they're going to do until that point is grumble about it.
Yeah.
One of the best things that we did at the airport was every year they did a PM review. Every year, solid, year in, year out. Except the attendance of that PM review was only the maintenance manager and the supervisor. When they involved my group, which was the planning, scheduling, dispatch group, and said, okay, now you're in charge of these PM reviews. What did we do? We were no experts in maintenance. None of us were. So we opened it up to the people performing the maintenance, the actual maintainers. We opened it up to the supervisor to attend, yes, the planner. We got the storeroom involved, and we had airport operations involved. And so when we expanded the team to all these people and everybody had different perspectives and we were analyzing the failures, a lot of great ideas came out from these PM reviews. So it became a much more effective way of tackling what changes needed to be made to the PM program. And not only that, but instead of tearing apart the conveyor every month, and as Jim said, why are you tearing it apart? We changed the inspection approach, right? That was listen to the conveyor. Does it need tinkering with? If it's operating fine,
the more I
change the belt every month.
The more I hear you guys talk about this, the more I'm realizing there needs to be a community attached to assets. And it has nothing to do with one person or a few people. It has to do with kind of like a forum of people tasked with the responsibility of keeping this beast of a thing running. And it makes way more sense for everyone to just butt heads and kind of help.
Well, people tend to think of reliability as a bit of an engineering discipline, and maybe it's in the maintenance hands. But when I do reliability centered maintenance analysis work, it's always with a team of maintainers and operators.
Yeah, community.
The very first question in the process is, what are the functions of the asset and the desired standards of performance? The maintainers all sit there with blank stares. They haven't got a clue. The operators are the only ones that can actually answer that one. Then when we start talking about failure modes and how things fail, then the maintainers are in their element, right? Mm-hmm. And what I find is, because I take a systems approach to it, very few of them actually have a full systems overview. They get it as they're doing the analysis, but the operators are the closest to it coming into it. And by the end of it, they all get it. So there's that group learning goes on. They gain respect for each other in the process because they're all having ideas and inputs. They're all part of the decision process because they made the decisions. It's theirs. They not only have buy-in, they do take ownership of the outcome of it. And I think that's one of the power of that method. When we do any kind of a review on any kind of a business process, always have a group of people involved, right? Like when I'm improving maintenance with a client at a big operation, for example, I want executive level sponsorship. I don't want just a maintenance manager. And I tell them right up front, I said, we need it. You're going to need to deal with supply chain issues, storeroom issues, human resources, training issues. Team. Operations and maintenance they often fight with each other. You need to get them to collaborate with each other. There's a whole bunch of collaborations that have to happen to make all this work well. And it's not going to happen if only the maintenance manager takes charge of it. So it's got to be that group effort. And I always want somebody senior that basically allows the authority to kind of drag the others into it, whether they want to be there or not, because you need them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the leadership piece comes in. And it's so critical for leadership to lay the foundation and environment to allow for a more proactive approach.
Exactly. So that's going from reactive to proactive.
I mean, I just keep thinking of Lord of the Rings.
Just changing the maintenance you're doing.
Exactly. It's a lot more. And I find that organizations will put in a program in place, and when it doesn't work, they'll abandon it, and it becomes a flavor of the month.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
As opposed to realize that it takes time before a person acquires a new skill, and it takes time for that new skill to become more productive than the previous skill. So, for example, right, and the example I use is driving a car. When you first learn how to drive, you don't know what you don't know, right? And then you take you're unconsciously unskilled. And then you take your first course in the theory of driving the car. And so now, guess what? Your performance goes way down because now you know what you don't know. And you get nervous.
Exactly.
Now you're consciously unskilled.
Yeah, you're consciously unskilled. Exactly. And so what ends up happening is that you need practice lessons behind that driver's ed wheel, right? Well, what happens when you're an experienced driver and you see someone in a driver's ed car? You speed up and try and pass them, right? Because, well, you're an experienced driver. You don't want to be stuck behind this unexperienced driver, right? So after time, though, they become consciously skilled, but their performance is still at the bottom because they're still thinking about things.
Yeah.
Well, after so many years of driving, do you stop and think, oh, the light just turned red, I better stop the car? Or are you thinking about the groceries that you need to pick up on the way home and, oh, the light turned red, I'm stopping? You unconsciously stop. Right? You're unconsciously skilled. And that's at that stage, that's when performance takes off.
And it even goes higher than
Organizations,
the
though,
level of
abandon that program down at the bottom, thinking, well, this didn't work.
Mhm.
It's the flavor of the month.
Exactly. Now, I like your driving example because, you as an experienced driver, you can be sitting in your car having a very deep, thoughtful conversation with your passenger and still stopping and starting and driving safely.
And passing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's because it's become kind of unconscious to you. Yeah, I was reminded of something during COVID. I started something totally different to help challenge my brain a little bit. I started violin lessons. I can't read music.
Good for you.
Anybody that's ever heard me at karaoke knows that I am almost tone deaf. Music is not a natural for me, put it that way. Anyway, here I am now, a year and a half, almost 2 years later, and I can play a bunch of songs, and a couple of them I can actually play quite well. And I was reminded by my instructor not long ago about practice and how practice is so important. And he made the point, and I've seen it a couple of times. It's funny when you see something or hear something, it starts popping up all over the place. He says, don't just practice until you can get it right. Practice until you can't get it wrong.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And that practice until you can't get it wrong is that level of unconscious competence that we're all striving for. And we don't, as Richard said, in many improvement initiatives, we don't let ourselves get there. Mm-hmm. I just finished reading a book called Mastery, and it's all about people, like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Benjamin Franklin, and others who developed a level of mastery in what they do, and the length of time it takes to get there is big, but they developed it because they dedicated themselves to it. And how many organizations that we work with actually put the effort into allowing a level of mastery to develop in planning and scheduling and reliability and in supply chain. They expect that things are going to change overnight, like the flavor of the month. Let's try it, and they run into problems at first, which is perfectly natural.
Yeah, they experience the natural dip, but they don't push through to get to that fourth stage.
They don't let you learn. They don't give you the time to learn from your lessons so that you can become good at it.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as you make a mistake, just got to stop doing that. That's going to hurt us. It will, and it will continue to for a little while. And you just got to recognize if you're going to make an improvement, it's going to hurt along the way.
Exactly.
And until you get through that, you're not going to develop that level of mastery. And like I said, I can play maybe a dozen different songs now on the violin. One, maybe two of them that I don't make mistakes in.
Yeah.
I'm still practicing all the other ones, and it's the same in any field: planning, scheduling, reliability. Right? People tell me, "Oh, you make reliability look easy when you do RCM." Well, yeah, I've been doing it for a long time. That's why they're doing it for the first time. They're still struggling between, what's the difference between a failure mode and an effect? What do you mean function? They just don't know yet, and they haven't had enough practice yet. It takes practice, and like I say, there's the ownership piece that we got to do it, and we're going to live with the results, so it's ours. But they also need to learn how to do it properly, and that takes time.
It takes time. That's it. It just takes time. There's no any other way around it. Right.
Yeah. But time, not just sitting around and waiting, that time is used to reinforce kind of everything. So it just becomes a
practice.
Yeah. And get coaching, get coaching along the way. Like, don't say, we took we did the course. We know how to do this, right? Never works. I don't care what the course is in. It won't work. You need help getting good at it. You need to develop competence. And in this move from reactive to proactive, you need to do it on a number of fronts at the same time. It's both the efficiency aspect, planning, scheduling, materials, supply, getting good at that, getting skilled and good at doing the work, and doing the right work, figuring out what is that right work, and just defining the right frequency to do it at, and then doing it efficiently. If you don't do all that together, you'll never move from reactive to proactive. You might make little steps, I'm not saying you won't gain anything, but you won't gain as much as you could if you don't tackle all of it.
Yep.
and have some patience. You know, yeah, you're going to make mistakes along the way. It happens every single time. You know, we got so good in the aircraft industry keeping airplanes in the air, but Wright brothers' first flight didn't last all that long. You know, in the early days, a lot of crashes happened. A lot of things went on. There was a lot of learning went on, right? And today,
and there's still a lot of learning. You know, you still had failures of aircraft. And, you know, there's still a lot of learning
The
that needs
Boeing
to take place.
nosedive glitch.
yep, you're never going to stop learning and improving. You know, generally we do it pretty good, but there's still little mistakes, right? And we've only been at it, I think it's almost 100 years exactly, isn't it? The Wright brothers were 1921 or something like that. So we're about 100 years later, and we finally, you know, we can honestly say we're pretty good at it, but we're still learning. It never stops. So that move, reactive to proactive, a lot of things, a lot of moving parts, a lot of collaboration. It's not just one.
And the right leadership.
That the leadership is needed to pull all that together. If you don't have that leadership pulling it together, it ain't going to happen, right? As I've seen maintenance managers that just lament the fact, oh, we tried RCM, never worked. Oh, who'd you have involved? Well, just these guys here, you know, the maintenance crew. Well, what kind of training did they have? Oh, well, I gave them all the book.
Yeah,
no. you know where that one's going. They didn't do the training. They didn't really learn it. Most guys don't read much, so that didn't happen, right? Who facilitated? Oh, I did. Oh, and then you quiz him a little bit, you know, and you find out he doesn't really know it either.
Yeah.
So it's not going to work. They didn't even get past the unconscious incompetence stage because they didn't even learn enough to know that they don't know it.
Yeah. You're asking the karate master, why aren't your students know this karate yet? And he's like, well, I gave them the book, but he's not actually being their sensei and, you know, utilizing the different ways that people learn, which was that immersive way, the communal way of, you know, brainstorming, you know, bring in a couple of varied experts. You know, sit down at the round table, you know, can be fun.
Well, you know, I've had clients ask me, you know, like, look, your book is published, we know what your method is and all that. And you know, why do we need you? And I said, first of all, most of your people won't read it. And even if they do, they won't get it. And none of them have any practice implementing all of it. So yeah, you know, I wrote that after a long period of experiencing not only doing all the little things that are in it, but doing them all together. And that makes a huge difference. Like that level of unconscious competence that you want to develop.
Yeah.
It takes learning, it takes coaching, it takes collaboration with other groups.
Unconsciously skilled.
And it takes a tolerance for making mistakes along the way that a lot of companies just don't allow themselves to make mistakes. And people are afraid to, like, oh, if I make a mistake, I'm going to get in trouble.
Yeah, exactly. And if
so
you
they
don't have that environment where people are allowed to make mistakes, then people won't take, you know, that extra step.
Exactly. Or to get more skilled or perform better.
And you know, part of the leadership is to let people know not only is it okay to make mistakes, but to demonstrate that it's okay to make mistakes. You can tell them, but they won't believe it if they don't see it.
Yeah. If you're going to talk the talk, better walk the walk, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Anyway, that's kind of, those are kind of my thoughts anyways on reactive to proactive. It's a big challenge. It's one that a lot of people want to make, but I don't think they know what they're getting into many times until they're into it, and then they get scared of it.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you need to practice.
Oftentimes they just focus on one of those two elements, right? The effectiveness piece or the efficiency piece, without realizing that you need both and tackle them both, as Jim said earlier, at the same time. Right?
You know, a lot of consultants, I've just bugged me to know, and a lot of consultants will tell them, look, you got to get good at planning and scheduling first before you can ever do reliability. I've been talking with a company up in the western part of the country right now that's kind of in that mode, and they just can't get it out of their head. Oh, we're too basic. We don't do this well yet, so we can't move on to reliability. And there's no question you need a certain level of discipline before the reliability work's really going to have all the benefit. But I wouldn't put it off for very long while you're developing that level of competency in planning and scheduling and work execution. That actually doesn't have to take nearly as long as a lot of people think it does.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, it's the reliability piece that helps you in your planning and scheduling, right?
I know.
I mean,
the more you've defined about what you're going to do, the more you can plan.
Yeah,
exactly. Right. So, the whole work identification piece that feeds into planning, right? One of the major components for it is reliability centered maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
That determines the tactics you're going to put in place.
And from the supply chain perspective, people think, oh, that's got nothing to do with reliability centered maintenance. But if you think about, ideally, you want to be able to forecast what materials are needed and when and in what quantities.
Exactly.
The more of your work that is proactive, the more of that you can actually forecast accurately.
Mm-hmm.
And, because you've taken it out of that reactive sort of, it might happen, it might not happen, into the realm of being a definite, we're going to do it. We know we need this. So you actually move a larger portion of your work to proactive. You also take a whole lot of your supply chain forecasting and move it into a much more well-defined, precise forecast, where risk isn't really part of the equation anymore.
And at the end of
that's
all
the other
this,
thing, people don't take a look at an overall annual plan and the forecast that can come out of that plan, right? Mm-hmm. And project out, okay, this is the level of resources we're going to require. This is the part requirements, demand requirements from that parts when we require them.
And people talk about doing zero-based budgeting, but very few really do anything even remotely close to it.
Yeah.
And budget. I mean, I almost laugh at budget time. People put so much effort into it. Yeah, when are we going to do this shutdown, that shutdown? I'm thinking, no. Why don't you ask yourself if you should even do the shutdown?
Yeah.
And the old method that I like is, year to date times 12/7, right? So and then add on a small percentage for inflation. Done.
That was my method at the airport.
Yeah. Anyway, we're off topic on that.
Yeah. For another
time. The better
time.
defined things are, the more you can do with precision.
And you need that buy-in, the communal buy-in of just like everyone banding together. And also a bonus poll question. I just saw it randomly today on Mobius Connect. There was this question that said, which one's better, predictive or preventative? And are they even conflict?
They're both.
You need both.
You need both.
You need both. Yeah. Some failures happen because of wear out and aging factors like fatigue and so on. The best way to deal with those is preventive. You can forecast when it's going to fail and you can time your replacement before that happens. Other failures, most failures, in fact, happen more randomly, and an age-based replacement really doesn't have any impact on it. Think of a light bulb, right? You know they're going to burn out eventually, but you don't know when. And you might change it and it burns out right away, or it might go for the next 5 years. You just don't know. That's random. Something that wears out on a regular basis are the tires on your car, depending on your driving style. They wear out at different rates. So it's going to happen, and you can do something about it before it gets to that totally worn, failed state where it's got no traction anymore. The light bulb, you don't know when it's going to happen. And you can't predict it either. So that one, the default is run it to failure. But predictive maintenance predicts when things are going to happen based on the condition that they are in. All right. And with the tires is a good one because both preventive and predictive work on tires. They're going to wear out, so you could just change them at a fixed interval. But you also have the little depth indicators in the tread look at, and that's by checking those, you're actually predicting how much useful life you've got left. So you're doing predictive when you do that. If you actually get to a point where you change them based on that, you've now done a corrective replacement based on a predictive observation. If you don't bother to look at the tread depth indicators and just change them out every 80,000 or whatever it is kilometers, then you're doing preventive, purely preventive.
Okay.
And, it's funny you use the tire as the example, because there's actually two measures that this current client site uses, right? And one is to rebuild the tire, and the other is for, exactly as Jim says, predict when we need to replace it.
Mm-hmm.
So they're completely on the predictive side.
Yeah.
So some things have both. Some things are only one or the other. And some things can't be predicted or prevented.
Yeah.
Light bulb, you cannot
Light bulb,
predict
perfect example.
You cannot prevent it. All right. Tires, you can do both.
So you can't help but to be reactive sometimes, but it's better to have a, generally a proactive setup, which I'm guessing proactive is a mix of both predictive and preventative.
Well, if you think of the light bulb, which is totally random, what is your strategy for dealing with replacement, right? If you think of lights in secure areas or parking lots where I start, and you want to make sure that you have a secure parking lot, your approach to that light bulb is going to be totally different to one in a closet.
Yeah. Right? You're actually going to have redundancy when you're going to run things to failure, right? Light bulbs, like I've got a light fixture over my head here, and it's got two bulbs in it, right? If one goes out, I don't lose my light. And that's actually the most common strategy for improving reliability, right? The function of that fixture is to shed light in this room. It does it, with a better effectiveness. It's got two bulbs, not because I want it brighter, because I want to keep the light on when the switch is on. And if one of them goes, the other one's likely to keep going. Mm-hmm. So that's a very common technique used in reliability to increase system reliability by adding redundancy.
Yeah. Pump A, pump B.
And if I have redundancy, I can rely on running things to failure, even if I can predict their failures, right? In the RCM training that we do, there's a very classic example of two pumps. They're identical in every respect, pumping the same thing. They're in the same plant. One of them is standalone, or actually three pumps. One of them is in a standalone service. If I lose it, I lose production. I want to do predictive maintenance on that guy. All right. The other two are in a duty and standby configuration. So one's running, one's waiting to start if the other one fails. I can actually let the one that's running run to failure, because I know if I've made sure that it's capable of starting, I can actually rely on that second pump. It's cost me more. The capital investment to do that has been, doubled effectively. But I know I won't lose service on that particular process because of the redundancy. So that's a way of increasing system reliability. It doesn't change the reliability of the pump one little bit, but it changes the system that it's used in substantially. Yeah. It's the systems that matter, when you get right down to it. Just like the light bulbs in my light fixture here. I want to keep the light on in the room. I don't need both bulbs. I only really need one, but I got two. And if one burns out, I've still got light. So the system of shedding light in the room is all that much more reliable. For what it's worth, I probably look a little light right now. And I got the light off. It's just a really bright day outside. And I've even got the curtains closed.
It is bright today. Maybe if we sit here long enough, the glare will go away.
In a few more hours, it'll start to get dark.
All right. Stay tuned, folks. We're going to be sitting here for 3 more hours to wait for.
But like a light bulb, it gets brighter before it gets dark, because that's west, and that's where the sun sets.
Yeah.
Good. There you go.
Well, I think we covered everything we said we would cover today, and damn well good at that.
Good. All right. Cool. So should we stop recording then?
Yeah, sure.